All right. So, for this deep dive, you guys sent us The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace D. Wattles,
Huh.
published way, way back in 1910.
Yeah.
And, we're going to try to kind of pull out the core insights here for you. This book has been incredibly influential. Rhonda Byrne of The Secret fame even credits it with, really kind of huge life changes for her.
Wow, yeah.
And, and really the thing that kind of sparked this whole exploration for her was this question: why do some people attract wealth while other people who seem to have, similar abilities, similar talents, similar backgrounds, kind of remain in poverty? And Wattles' answer right from the start is that it's not about, your background, your education, your talents, or even where you live.
Yeah, I think, Byrne's question really gets to the heart of it, right? Like, why are there these disparities? And Wattles, I mean, he took a pretty revolutionary stance, I think, for his time.
Mm-hmm.
Even now, I think it's pretty revolutionary to just assert that these disparities aren't due to some kind of, external limitations. And you can hear that right from the beginning. His mission in writing this book is to lay out these principles that anyone can use to become wealthy, regardless of their circumstances.
Right.
And he kicks off chapter 1 with a line that really grabs you. He says, "Whatever may be said in praise of poverty, the fact remains that it is not possible to live a really complete or successful life unless one is rich."
It certainly cuts to the chase, right?
Yeah.
So what is the core idea here? What is the science that he's talking about?
Yeah, I think the fundamental insight here is that wealth isn't a matter of luck or privilege or, any of those things. It's really a result of applying specific principles. It's kind of like you follow the recipe, you get the cake, so to speak. He really argues that anyone, no matter where they start, can attract wealth by understanding and then consistently applying these principles.
Yeah.
And he's very clear that this isn't some abstract philosophical debate or anything like that.
Yeah.
This is a practical guide for people who, he says, want to get rich first and then maybe delve into the why later.
Yeah.
He even asks you to take some of his ideas initially on faith. Kind of like, you accept scientific laws, from scientists. You don't necessarily go out and run the experiments yourself to verify them.
Right.
And he says, take these ideas on faith and then prove them through your own actions.
So it's a very results-oriented kind of philosophy.
Yeah.
But he does touch on some of those underlying beliefs that inform his ideas, right?
He does. He briefly mentioned something called the monistic theory, which is basically this idea that one is all and that all is one.
Okay.
So everything we see as separate is actually part of a single, unified reality. And this is an ancient concept. It goes way back. But it's been very influential for a lot of thinkers, for example, Spinoza, who explored the concept of a single underlying substance.
Mm-hmm.
So Wattles is drawing from this tradition to suggest this kind of unified foundation for all reality. He even points to Hegel and Emerson for those who want to kind of explore those philosophical underpinnings a little further.
That's interesting background. So with that as a foundation, what's the first key principle that Wattles lays out for us?
Well, the first crucial insight is what he calls the inherent right to be rich.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's not talking about just having enough to get by.
Right.
For Wattles, true richness, it means having everything you need and want to live a powerful, elegant, beautiful, and genuinely rich life. And he even makes a pretty strong statement. He suggests that being content with less when you're capable of enjoying more is actually sinful, because he believes that the fundamental purpose of nature is this continuous growth and advancement of life.
Okay. Sinful. That's pretty strong word to use. So how does he define a rich person in this context? What does he mean by that?
Yeah, he has a very specific definition. I think it really ties to this idea of potential. So a rich person, for him, is someone who possesses everything they desire to live the fullest life they are capable of living. Mm. And he argues that in today's complex world, even individuals that we might consider average, they need a significant level of wealth to truly experience complete life.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the opportunities, the experiences, the ability to contribute. All these things are often facilitated by financial resources, right?
Absolutely. And then he connects this to kind of our innate drive, right? Like we all have this drive to become the best version of ourselves. Yeah. And he argues that true success in life is about realizing your full potential, becoming who you truly want to be. And to do that, you need to be able to use things. And to use things, you need to be able to acquire them.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to this, central importance of becoming rich enough to obtain them.
Right.
So understanding this science of getting rich isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's really presented as the most essential knowledge for anyone who is striving for a complete and successful existence.
Okay, so wanting to be rich isn't this negative desire. In his view, it's really tied to this fundamental human drive for growth.
Precisely. He reframes the desire for riches as a natural yearning for a richer, fuller, and more abundant life, which, he says, is entirely praiseworthy. In fact, he goes so far as to say that not desiring this kind of expansive life is abnormal. And then he breaks down our kind of core motivations into 3 areas. He talks about the body, the mind, and the soul. And he stresses that none of these is superior to the others. They're all equally important, and they all require complete life and expression.
So it's about this holistic kind of flourishing.
Exactly. He argues that a truly complete life, it necessitates fulfillment in all 3 of these areas, body, mind, and soul.
Yeah.
And he says that material possessions, that they're actually vital tools for achieving this fulfillment.
Right. You need resources for nourishment and well-being for the body, opportunities for learning and growth for the mind, and the capacity for generosity and connection for the soul.
Right. Exactly. And this is why Wattles places such supreme importance on wealth. He says it's the key to unlocking a fully expressed life across all these dimensions.
So the book proposes that getting rich, it isn't just some random stroke of luck. It's not just, being in the right place at the right time, but that it's a systematic process. There's a science to it. It has its own rules, almost like algebra or something.
You got it. And that's really the core message of Chapter 2, which is titled, There is a Science of Getting Rich. He very boldly claims that it's an exact science, just like mathematics.
Okay.
He says there are definite laws that govern how wealth is acquired.
Right.
And if you learn these laws and you follow them consistently, then becoming rich is a certainty. Conversely, those who don't follow this approach, regardless of how hard they work or what their inherent talents might be, they tend to remain in poverty.
Yeah.
And so, he's emphasizing a fundamental natural law here, like causes always produce like effects, right? So therefore, anyone who can learn to consistently do things in this certain way will inevitably become rich.
Now, he addresses some of the common explanations for why people get rich or stay poor, like, their environment, their upbringing, things like that, right?
He does. He directly tackles this idea that your surroundings, are the primary determinant of your financial success. And he does this by, pointing to the undeniable reality that you see rich and poor individuals living side by side in the same neighborhood, sometimes even working in the same fields.
Right.
So he says if environment were the sole factor, you'd expect a much more uniform distribution of wealth.
Right.
But the fact that you see these, huge disparities, it suggests that something else is at play.
So what about, exceptional talent? Some people are just born with certain skills and abilities that give them a leg up. Is that what he attributes it to?
He also dismisses that. He actually says that superior talent is not the key.
Really?
Yeah, and he points to this by noting, countless examples of highly talented individuals who struggle financially.
Yeah.
While, others with seemingly average abilities are able to accumulate significant wealth.
Right.
So his conclusion is that it's not superior talent, it's this consistent, certain way of acting that leads to riches.
So then what about saving and being frugal?
Right.
That's something that we hear all the time. You got to be thrifty. You got to save your pennies if you want to get rich. Is that what he says?
Yeah, that's a good point. He actually downplays the importance of saving as the primary driver of getting rich. And he observes that many extremely thrifty individuals remain poor their whole lives, while others who might be considered more free spending are able to accumulate wealth.
Okay.
So his point is that it's not about hoarding resources, it's about generating them through this specific approach.
Okay, so it's not environment, it's not talent, it's not just sheer hard work and saving. What is this certain way? Is it something that anyone can learn and apply?
That's exactly the point. That's the empowering message he wants to convey.
Okay.
That if becoming rich is the predictable outcome of doing things in a certain way, and if causes always produce like effects, that anyone who is capable of learning and applying this method can become rich. And he emphasizes, this isn't some complex secret that's accessible only to, a select few.
Yeah.
He points to the fact that you've seen people across the spectrum of natural abilities, right?
Okay.
So talented and less so, intellectually gifted and average, they're physically strong, physically weak, and they all achieve wealth. So his conclusion is that if you have the basic capacity to read and understand his book, you absolutely possess the ability to get rich.
Now, he acknowledges that your location and the people you interact with in business are factors, right?
Yeah, he does. He says, obviously, your location, the people you're doing business with, those are things to consider. But he reiterates that if others in your community are achieving wealth, then you can too. And it doesn't matter the specific industry. The key isn't the particular business itself, but the manner in which you conduct it. It's about consistently doing things in that certain way. And he even addresses the lack of initial capital.
Okay.
So he says, obviously having financial resources can accelerate the process of accumulating wealth, but it's not a prerequisite for starting.
Right.
So by beginning to act in this certain way, you'll naturally begin to attract the resources that you need as part of the process.
Okay. So he's painting this picture of a system that's fundamentally democratic, accessible to anyone who's willing to learn and apply it. Now, he also addresses the concern that opportunities might be limited, right? That there's only so much to go around.
He does, yeah. In Chapter 3, which is titled, Is Opportunity Monopolized? He directly confronts that very, very valid concern.
Yeah, okay.
And he argues that no one is inherently destined for poverty because, all the opportunities have been snatched up by others. He acknowledges that, entering certain highly concentrated industries might present significant hurdles. He uses the example of major railway systems. That was a big thing in his era.
Right.
And, he says, yeah, it's probably pretty difficult to break into that. But then he immediately points to emerging fields. So, electric railways at the time. And he even, very prophetically envisions, air travel becoming a major industry.
Right.
So his core message is that, if one avenue seems blocked, there are always other paths to explore.
So it's about having that vision to see where the new opportunities are emerging rather than dwelling on these perceived limitations?
Precisely. He uses this interesting example of a worker in a steel trust, who might be feeling very trapped.
Yeah. And
he suggests that, by consistently acting in this certain way, that individual could eventually transition out of their employment, maybe acquire a small farm, and become a producer of essential goods.
Okay.
And this highlights the agricultural opportunities that he saw at the time. Mm-hmm. And he even asserts that, acquiring the land, getting the resources, it's possible if you approach it in this certain way.
Yeah.
And he emphasizes that the landscape of opportunity is constantly shifting, right? Based on the needs of society, on the ongoing progress of civilization, there are always new opportunities emerging.
Now, he even touches on the situation of the working class as a whole, right?
It does, yeah.
Which is kind of fascinating for a book that's primarily focused on individual wealth.
Right. He challenges this notion that workers are inherently kept down, whether it's by their employers or, by large corporations.
Yeah.
He proposes that if the working class as a collective, chose to adopt this certain way of thinking and acting, then they could collectively generate their own opportunities. And he cites examples of successful cooperative industries in other countries. Mm-hmm. He even suggests that, the working class could, in effect, become the master class by embracing these principles because the fundamental laws of wealth creation, they apply universally. Mm-hmm. But he also emphasizes that individual workers don't need to wait for this, kind of collective shift.
Right.
They can start to follow the tide of opportunity towards their own riches by learning and implementing these principles themselves.
What's his perspective on the actual availability of wealth in the world? Is it a finite resource in his view?
No.
No.
Not at all. He firmly believes that there is more than enough wealth to go around for everyone. Yeah. And he uses some really, really vivid imagery. Yeah. He suggests that you could build a palace, as large as the Capitol building, for every family on Earth using only the building materials available in the United States.
Wow.
And this is back in 1910, right? So you can imagine.
Yeah.
He also speaks to the vast potential of intensive agriculture to produce, an abundance of food and clothing for the entire global population. So for Wattles, the visible supply of resources is practically inexhaustible. And then the invisible supply, which he refers to as the formless stuff, is truly limitless.
This formless stuff keeps coming up. It sounds like it's pretty central to his philosophy. So what exactly is it?
Yeah.
And how does it factor into this science of getting rich?
Yeah, this is a cornerstone concept, and he really delves into it deeply in Chapter 4, which is appropriately titled The First Principle in the Science of Getting Rich.
Okay.
And he states unequivocally that thought is the only power which can produce tangible riches from the formless substance. He describes this substance as a thinking essence. And any thought of a specific form held within this substance actually brings that form into being. So he explains that this original substance moves and manifests according to its thoughts.
Okay.
Every form and process we observe in nature, it's simply the visible expression of thought within this original substance.
So in his view, the entire universe as we know it is essentially a manifestation of thought.
Yeah, that's his profound proposition.
Wow.
He posits that we inhabit a thought world that is part of a much larger thought universe. So the very thought of a dynamic, ever-evolving universe, it extended throughout this formless substance. And this thinking essence, responding to that initial thought, took the form of planets, stars, galaxies, and continues to sustain that form. So thinking substance inherently takes the form of its thought, and it moves in accordance with it.
Okay.
And he uses this analogy of an oak tree.
Okay.
So, the thought of an oak tree doesn't instantly conjure a fully grown tree.
Right. But it initiates the forces that will, through established patterns of growth, eventually produce that tree.
Okay, so thoughts possess a fundamental creative power within this model. So where do human beings fit into this grand scheme? What's our role?
Yeah, well, he argues that humanity occupies a unique position as a thinking center with the capacity for original thought.
Okay.
And he points out that everything we create with our hands must first take shape in our minds. We can't physically manifest something until we've first conceived of it.
Right.
However, he contends that, up until this point, humanity has primarily focused on, physically manipulating existing forms rather than tapping into this potential to create new forms by directly impressing our thoughts onto this formless substance.
So we've been largely operating below our potential, not fully utilizing this inherent creative power that we have.
That's his assertion.
Okay.
He suggests that, while we become very skillful at taking existing materials and shaping them according to the images in our minds,
we haven't fully grasped the ability to directly collaborate with this formless intelligence to bring things into existence.
So are you saying that we can actually produce things directly from this formless substance?
He proposes that we can, yes, by effectively communicating our thoughts to it.
Wow.
And the purpose of his book, really, is to demonstrate that this is a capability that's accessible to everyone.
Okay.
And then to provide a how-to. And this leads him to articulate 3 fundamental propositions.
And what are these foundational ideas that underpin his entire science?
Okay. So first he states that there is one original formless stuff or substance from which everything in the universe originates.
Okay.
So all the seemingly distinct elements that we perceive, they're simply different expressions of this single underlying essence, and all the different forms in nature, they're just different shapes molded from this same fundamental material.
Okay.
Second, he emphasizes that this substance is inherently thinking in nature, and any thought held within it inevitably manifests as the form of that thought.
Okay.
So thought in this thinking substance creates shapes. And then finally, he posits that humankind, as a thinking center capable of generating original thought, possesses the ability to communicate these thoughts to this original thinking substance, and thereby initiate the creation or the formation of the object or circumstance that is being thought about.
Wow.
So he summarizes these 3 points very succinctly.
Okay.
He says, number 1, there is a thinking stuff from which all things are made and which, in its original state, permeates, penetrates, and fills the interspaces of the universe.
Okay.
Number 2, a thought in this substance produces the thing that is imaged by the thought.
Okay.
And number 3, man can form things in his thought, and by impressing his thought upon formless substance, can cause the thing he thinks about to be created.
Okay, so it all kind of boils down to the power of our thoughts and how we intentionally direct them. Now, he also talks about this concept of thinking in a certain way. What exactly does that entail?
Right. So he emphasizes that to achieve wealth by doing things in a certain way, you must first cultivate the ability to think in a certain way.
Okay.
And he argues that your outward actions are a direct reflection of your inner thoughts. So to consistently act in the manner that leads to your desired outcomes, to achieve the results that you're seeking, you must first develop the capacity to think in the way that aligns with those goals.
Right.
And the initial and most critical step in this mental discipline, he says, is to consciously think truth, regardless of any contradictory appearances in the external world.
Thinking truth regardless of appearances, that sounds like a pretty significant mental challenge.
He acknowledges that.
Yeah.
He says that while every individual possesses this inherent capacity to think whatever they choose,
Okay.
it requires considerably more mental discipline and effort to think in opposition to what seems outwardly true.
Right.
It's easy to succumb to thinking according to appearances.
Yeah.
So, if you're surrounded by poverty, it's a very natural tendency to think thoughts of lack.
Right.
However, actively thinking the truth, that abundance is the underlying reality, despite what you currently see, that's a very demanding mental exercise. It requires significant sustained effort. And he even describes sustained and consecutive thought as the most demanding work imaginable.
Wow.
Particularly, he says, when the perceived reality contradicts the truth that you're trying to hold in your mind.
Right.
And he explains that every visible manifestation in the world around us tends to create a corresponding thought form in our own minds. And so the only way to counteract this is by consciously and persistently holding the thought of the truth.
So, for example, if we're confronted with illness, should we actively focus our thoughts on the underlying truth of health?
Exactly.
Okay.
He suggests that focusing on the appearance of disease can actually solidify and even manifest the form of disease in your own mind, and ultimately in your physical body.
Yeah.
Unless you steadfastly hold on to the thought of the truth. And he declares that the truth is that disease is an illusion. It's an appearance.
Okay.
The fundamental reality is vibrant health.
No.
Similarly, dwelling on the appearance of poverty can breed corresponding thoughts of scarcity.
Yeah.
Unless you consciously maintain the truth that poverty is not a fundamental reality, but rather that abundance is. So he acknowledges that, consistently thinking thoughts of health in the presence of widespread disease, or thinking thoughts of riches of its widespread poverty, this demands significant mental fortitude.
Right.
But he asserts that those who develop this mental discipline become what he calls a mastermind.
A mastermind. Capable of transcending limiting circumstances and attaining whatever they desire. And this power, he explains, it originates from firmly grasping the fundamental truth, that there is a single thinking substance from which everything is created, and that every thought held within this substance takes on a corresponding form. And when we truly internalize this understanding, he believes doubt and fear dissipate because we recognize our inherent ability to create the reality that we envision.
So as we digest these initial principles from The Science of Getting Rich, it's clear that Wattles is proposing a pretty significant shift in how we understand wealth and really our own capacity to achieve it. He's suggesting that it's less about external circumstances and more about cultivating this specific way of thinking.
Yeah.
And, aligning ourselves with what he describes as this fundamental creative force of the universe. It definitely gives us a lot to think about.
It certainly does. And perhaps that's the most significant takeaway from this initial exploration.
Just consider the implications of a universe where thought operates as the fundamental creative force. If your consistent thoughts, held with genuine faith and a clear purpose, truly possess the power to shape your reality, what is one specific limiting belief that you might actively challenge and begin to reshape in your own mind starting today?